my thoughts on the state of the world, which this conference apparently thinks is on fire. Now, on fire has many connotations, and there's a cricket match going on right now. I think Mohammad Siraj is on fire. New Zealand is 19 for 2. But in this case, I do appreciate that the fire is actually almost literal, and that we are meeting in an exceptionally difficult time. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for actually crystallizing my own thinking for this panel by asking me to reflect on 3 interconnected concepts: geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the polycrisis. Now, the nature of my business is such that challenges will always be at the center of the conversation. This is not to say that we don't have outcomes, advancements, or even progress. On the contrary, there has been a lot of evidence to show, and really there's no question whether we are speaking from the perspective of India or from the perspective of the world, that we are far better off today than we were a decade or 2 or 5 before. Yet, precisely because every set of solutions throws up a new generation of problems, we constantly dissect, analyze, debate, and sometimes even agonize. The really good people in my business, however, also imagine, anticipate, and foresee. So today, we need both an evolutionary approach as well as audacious thinking, however contradictory that might seem. And the reason for that is the churning on multiple fronts that the world is going through, not merely simultaneous stresses, but many with a clear potential for structural change, and at the same time, the overwhelming compulsion to ensure stability or at least mitigate catastrophes as the process of change unfolds. So let us then contemplate the major stress factors of our times. The most obvious and immediate is the devastation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Long COVID is not just a medical condition, it is even more a social and economic damage that many societies are experiencing, and one has to look to the extent that they can be rectified. It has also rolled back SDG progress in many countries, and in quite a few cases revived challenges of nutrition, health, and gender divides that we were putting behind us. In some cases, the nature and effectiveness of governance came into question during the pandemic. Moreover, as supply chains started fraying, national insecurities emerged sharply and have actually continued to influence our thinking even after the pandemic. And not least, the iniquities of globalization were on stark display during the pandemic. Vaccine apartheid was its most graphic manifestation, when some nations had 8 times the stock of their population, while others just next door waited for their first vial. A second contributor to volatility is conflict in a globalized world, where consequences spread far beyond the immediate geography. We have already experienced this in respect of Ukraine. The ripple impact of what is taking place right now in the Middle East is still not entirely clear. Now, these particular cases may be headline news, but in different regions there are smaller happenings whose impact is not inconsequential. In the domain of violence, there is also the less formal version, if you would, that is very pervasive. I speak here of terrorism, which has long been honed and practiced as a tool of statecraft. The basic takeaway for all of us is that given the seamlessness of our existence, any expectation that conflicts and terrorism can be contained in their impact is no longer tenable. A big part of this is clearly economic, but do not underestimate the danger of metastasis when it comes to radicalism and extremism. No danger is too distant anymore. Now, speaking of dangers, it is necessary to also look at the directly disruptive impact of climate events on the international economy. We have long debated that climate challenges as a trend undermine the well-being of our planet. However, as weather patterns shift, and often catastrophically so, they can affect the nodes of production as well as the supply chains that emanate from them. Given the increasing frequency of such weather happenings, this is now a risk that we need to build into our calculations. The working of the global economy has itself added to the concerning side of the ledger. The last few years have witnessed rising debt, often resulting from a combination of imprudent choices, unwise borrowings, and opaque projects. Market volatility has been difficult for smaller economies with a narrow trade basket to handle. Those highly exposed to tourism or remittances have experienced the consequences of slowdowns very strongly. International financial institutions have not been able to respond adequately, whether due to paucity of resources or lack of priority. Underlying all these concerns, however, are actually the structural deficiencies about which we can no longer be in denial. Since the Second World War ended and decolonization proceeded, we have actually seen a broadening of economic production and consumption across geographies. Obviously, this was bound to be uneven and non-linear, but overall, few would disagree with the proposition that the trend line was positive. This was especially so if one looked at it generation by generation, while of course making some provisions for anomalies. As globalization, in the incarnation that we know currently, got underway, much stronger economic improvements became visible. Entire countries, in fact entire regions, saw dramatic reductions in poverty and impressive improvement in living standards. We in India have experienced this in our own lifetimes. However, what has been inadequately recognized is that this whole exercise had both winners and losers. They can be individual countries or broader regions. They can also be constituencies within societies. And they can even be those who have been bypassed altogether. Assessments about benefits and losses may be absolute, they may be relative, or they could be comparative, but any which way, they eventually translated into politics. In the international discourse for 2.5 decades, the conversation was largely dominated by globalization advocates who were themselves clearly beneficiaries. They portrayed those unhappy as outliers, if not worse. The mantra of opening up became so powerful that its social consequences was completely dismissed. And then one day, all of this has caught up with us. The last decade has therefore witnessed what were read as political earthquakes. If they took us off guard, it is because we didn't listen to the earlier tremors for so long. Now, my intention is not so much to dwell on the past as to caution that this is a continuing, possibly even intensifying process. Addressing the over-concentration of production has become a strategic necessity today. And recognizing the concentration of dissatisfaction is equally a political imperative. Those charged with responsibilities for international economic negotiations cannot disregard either. Part of the problem that we are all grappling with is that the reality that a substantial segment of the global economy is no longer market-based. Not just that, also the realization that large market shares, either as a producer or as a consumer, can be leveraged for non-economic purposes. As the knowledge economy advanced and the embedding of data became more pervasive, concerns of privacy, reliability, and security have all fused together. This has not happened overnight, and the truth is that the world sought to keep international economics to business as usual as long as possible. But as the last few years have brought home, and the COVID has really been a wake-up call in that regard, that is no longer tenable. We are rapidly entering an era of artificial intelligence and must think beyond Westphalian economics and factor in political sociology of production. This means that for all of us now, there has to be a sharp focus on how to create more resilient and reliable supply chains. It mandates a greater emphasis on trust and transparency in all facets of the digital domain. Important and admittedly difficult as both endeavors are, they are still only the building blocks of a larger re-globalization that must be attempted for our common good. We are all aware of the animated debate in the last years about decoupling, including its merits and its viability. Given the enormity and the intensity of globalized production today, the viability issue itself sets to rest the question of merit. The conversation has therefore shifted to de-risking, where the focus is narrower and the goals presumably more achievable. Much of this discourse takes place against the larger backdrop of big power strategic competition, and therefore does not do justice to the interests of the rest of the world. Even if we put politics aside, there is a powerful case today for de-risking simply because the current levels of economic concentration are just too high to be relied upon in difficult times. After all, we saw that during the COVID pandemic. Additional engines of growth will not only provide multiple options, but also expand zones of prosperity and of demand. The democratization of globalization would help grow its support constituency and accelerate economic rebalancing that has come such a long way already. It would work in tandem with our larger objectives on SDG realization and of green growth. We may therefore think of it today as a kind of portfolio management rather than imbue the entire process with unnecessary geopolitical connotations. Apart from our collective commitment to enhancing global economic stability, it is also necessary that we take into account the imperatives of strategic autonomy. The COVID experience essentially challenged many beliefs and assumptions about the working of the international community. National behavior, with rare exceptions, turned out to be far more self-centered than we thought we were. Our first discovery was in the domain of health, starting with masks, PPEs, medicines, and finally with vaccines. Certain regions were understandably deeply anxious when it came to ensuring food availability. Logistics and travel emerged as issues of contention, and outcomes were more an assertion of capability rather than an expression of fairness. The larger implications of the Ukraine conflict have now actually added new layers of insecurity. When it came to the 3 Fs of fuel, food, and fertilizer, the power of the market was used to substitute, divert, and deny. In interesting ways, we are also in the process of creating new vulnerabilities. Fossil fuel exposure, for example, may end up replaced by renewable technology concentration. Even as we deal with current and future worries, the fact is that most of us now are planning to go the extra mile just to be sure. Globalization, therefore, has to take into account not just in time, today, but also that being hedged by just in case. Another change that should be recognized is in the dispersal of power and the reordering of the global hierarchy. The most powerful nations are comparatively not as powerful as they used to be in the past. Middle powers have started to come into their own. At least in their particular region, they sometimes have more clout and definitely more skin in the game than those distant. We have seen this clearly in the Gulf. We are now seeing it in the Middle East. In different ways, it is happening too in Asia and Africa and Latin America. We in South Asia are also more aware that solutions have to come from within. Whether it is the first responder operations in the Indian Ocean, COVID-related assistance, or the economic support that we gave to Sri Lanka, India is clearly adjusting to this new emerging architecture. Having presented this larger picture to all of you, allow me to share a few examples of how India is responding to evolving geopolitics, geoeconomics, and polycrisis. I do this through 5 examples. 1. By refocusing the G20 on growth and development and highlighting the distress of the global south. And this we did by also sponsoring the permanent membership of the African Union. 2. By itself participating more intensively in global value chains. Make in India and make for the world, as well as production-linked incentives are notable features. 3. Investing in critical and emerging technologies, including through transnational partnerships. A more vigorous Indian presence in the semiconductor domain is one expression, the rollout of its own 5G stack another. A 4th example, reimagining and redoing our global commitments to make them more contemporary. The Quad stands out in the Indo-Pacific, and the I2U2 and the IMEC in the Middle East. Even established relationships need refreshing, and I have just been discussing that in the last few days in Singapore. We are looking at global hubs. We are looking at more mutually beneficial FTAs. We are looking at deeper engagement with Africa, at greater development partnerships. We currently have it with 78 countries, and preparing for a larger footprint. And finally, getting ready for the global workplace through stronger education, more skills, enhanced quality of HR, and mobility understandings. We believe that a combination of a knowledge economy, a digital existence, and demographic shifts provide an extraordinary opportunity. So, once again, I thank you all for the opportunity to present my views on this subject, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Before I turn to the 2 distinguished panelists, allow me to ask one or two follow-up questions. You did per se mention about some of the notable features of the G20 presidency of India. Our presidency, Minister, will formally conclude in a couple of weeks' time from now. If in retrospect you were to look back, what do you think, would you believe, are the couple of very salient features where we believe that we have furthered the cause of global society, of South and India, and fostered the forces of growth and stability? And what do you think are the one or two areas where you would have wished deeper and more abiding progress to take place? Minister.
I think looking back, we have good reason to be satisfied, and we are not entirely looking back. We still have a month and a half to go. A second observation, it was our presidency, a lot happened, but a lot happened because the other 19 nations also worked with us. I think that's very important to note. What was it, I would take great satisfaction in? I think most of all, to bring back the G20 to the goal of growth and development, which is the fundamental remit of the G20. And the events of the previous year had somewhere clouded that vision. It was understandable in a way, but nevertheless, the feeling after Bali was that many of the crucial issues, especially of the global South, did not get the attention that they deserve. So this hammering away at the global South, by convening a meeting of the global South, by having more guests, by bringing in the African Union as a permanent member. And then if you look at the key takeaways, the SDG action plan, the Green Development Pact, women-led development, digital public infrastructure, sustainable lifestyles. Each one of this is actually very, very central to the future of the global South. So after September, it's very interesting. I was in the UN at the end of September for the UN General Assembly. There were people who came up to me and said, congratulations, you actually managed to finesse a very complicated geopolitical issue. They were talking about Ukraine. But many more countries came up to me and said, thank you, you are actually able to get the spotlight on exactly what we wanted it to be. So I think that would be recorded really, when maybe 10 years from now people look at the Indian presidency. I think the Indian presidency would be associated very deeply with that focus on the global South's problems, and to me really the seriousness with which an effort with which you have been associated also, the reform of the IFIs, the idea that without resources neither SDGs nor green growth, green development are really going to advance, especially in the post-COVID era.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up of that, you did mention, Minister, about the new initiatives on the Quad. We know about the International Solar Alliance, the I2U2, and so on. Do you believe that these sub-kind of non-multilateral type cooperation can be blended together in the persistent Indian belief that multilateral systems of cooperation are best designed for global good, and the efforts and the interests of the South countries are best served in a multilateral framework? How do you see a reconciliation between these kinds of sub-multilateral institutions with a broader march towards strengthening multilateral institutions?
I see a coexistence, not always a happy one, but I see a coexistence. And we will have a coexistence for this reason. In many domains, if you take the universe of the international community, which is roughly about 200 nations, there are many domains where they are deeply split. There are many domains where they will not be able to get the lowest common understanding they need to proceed forward. So what would now, either we say, let's hold progress until we all agree on it. I think countries, the issues are too pressing. I think countries and people are too impatient. So what is happening already is you have these, you can say the groups of the willing coalescing around specific agendas. Now, there could be a corridor, there could be, say International Solar Alliance is actually about countries, there are about 100 odd countries today who have signed up because they attach importance to the propagation and the primacy of solar energy. So, depending on the issue, depending on the region, depending on the combination of countries, you're going to get these groups and they will live side by side with the rest of the world. And a challenge to global diplomacy would be that how do you harmonize it, how do you make sure that they work in a supporting manner and not in an undermining manner. But that's the reality of the world we have, and I don't think we can wish it away.
Thank you. Are you concerned really, Minister, of the sudden spurt in too many regional conflicts? You know what I'm alluding to. I'm also alluding to the Israel-Hamas conflict, in addition to other kinds of conflicts. Do you find this sudden spurt on account of the fact that the world is getting away from a unipolar, a bipolar world into accepting arrangements which are somewhat more disaggregated and somewhat more plurilateral?
Unipolar world is distant history. Bipolar world was even more distant in the bipolarity of US-Soviet Union. And I don't think US-China will really end up bipolar. I think there are too many other, as I said, too many next-rung powers with sufficient clout and autonomous activity and regions of their own dominance and primacy for that to happen. So, to my mind, actually, a lot of our analysis needs to overcome a kind of the burden of past constructs, which often shape us. We are artificially imposing that on a particular situation. The reality is, at one level, yes, we are far more globalized, but we are also, as I said in my remarks, I mean, if you look today at what is happening in the Middle East, a lot of it is actually, in a sense, the activities are intrinsic to the Middle East. If you compare it, let us say, with 1973 or 1967, they're very different. So, the key global players on major key regional players on regional situations are actually today going to be so dominant compared to the past that they're not going to leave that much space for global players or external players to come in. And I think you can see that happening in Africa as well.
Thank you. I now have great pleasure in requesting Ambassador Emily Monchelin, former economist, former minister from France, to make some opening observations or make some comments. Do you see any missing link in the sort of issues we have discussed or in the scenario we have talked about? Ambassador Emily.
Dear Minister, I'm very honored to be here in Delhi under the invitation of NK Singh for now 4 days. And I must say, it seems that we discussed a lot about how to finance the ambition of the country here in India and the ambitions of emerging and developing countries. I must say, before to go to the missing person, I think I will disclose, I think we must talk much more about private financial actors in this discussion about geopolitics and geoeconomics, and I will come to this. But initially I was really not surprised, because I know this is the way France and India work, but I think most of the words of your speech are exactly on what my President Macron is trying to push. Therefore, I think the very good strategic partnership we have with India. my president and my country believes very, very deeply that we should move with those who want to find solutions and avoid all the dividing elements, features, all the very expected, unanimous consensus globally that will just delay action in face of the global challenges we face. So Prime Minister Modi and President Macron organized in June a summit about a new financing global pact. And this, now what we call the Paris Pact for People and Planet, is a coalition of the willing of 35 countries, among which France and India and many others, to say 4 basic things which I think are very important. One, we cannot distinguish the fight against poverty and the fight against climate change. The more we divide the issues, the more we will be losing time and losing capacity to act. The second is exactly the fact that we need to recognize that countries should have the choice to define their own strategies to reach these objectives. It cannot be imposed top-down, because if we impose top-down, we know the backlash it creates and the inefficiencies. Third is we need more public money. As you know, France has been doing the double of its fair share when it comes to the 100 billion of climate finance. We were supposed to give more or less 5 billion per year. In 2021, we gave 10 billion. In 2022, we gave more than 7 billion. So we're doing our bilateral part. But we are very frustrated because the multilateral part is not working as it should. And therefore, we support very actively the MDB reform, the more resource mobilization. And then I'm coming to the 4th point of this pact, which is private sector mobilization. I'm very surprised that after Nick Stern and many officials present the numbers, saying to reach the amounts we need to mobilize 600 billion of private finance, along with guarantees, along with grants, along with concessional finance. There is not more people trying to work hard on how we will reach this 500 or 600 billion of mobilized private capital to reach our goals. And here I'm, just giving you 3 examples of things we should, I think, collectively, with India, with experts, with economists all around here in the room. One, we should avoid creating any new instrument not using financial leverage. I give you an example. There are some global vertical climate environment funds where you take €1 of a European taxpayer, you give it to the fund, you have the management fees, you have inflation, and maybe one day India will receive 60 cents. We much prefer schemes where we give $1 to a fund, who then raise $5, and then come to India not 60 cents, but $6. So we have to use the power of financial markets, of financial leverage, to multiply the flows of bilateral and multilateral support. If we do this, it's 6 times more, 10 times more private money, which is a kind of blending that will arrive in emerging and developing countries. The second thing is, I said to NK Singh, Larry Summers and himself wrote very important reports on MDB reforms, Volume 1, Volume 2. I would urge us to write a Volume 3, which would be, do we have the financial regulation we need to do what the Volume 1 and 2 are asking us to do? That's 2 examples for you.
That's your case.
If you say we need blended finance, we all say this. Today, the post-2008 financial crisis regulation has not even imagined what blended finance is. So the very day you do a blended finance instrument, when you import this instrument on the balance sheet of a European, an American large bank, Basel III rules will tell you, oh my God, this looks like securitization. So you have a huge liquidity coverage ratio call. You have to block a lot of money because they look at the product as if it was, these mortgage-backed securities in the US when it was not actually balanced. Another example is a lot of the UK regulation, of the European regulation, now created arbitrary barriers for OECD savings going outside OECD. very concrete. You invest in infrastructure, whatever the rating of the infrastructure. If it's an infrastructure project in the OECD, you have to put 25% of capital charge on the insurance company. You invest in the same project in India, or wherever outside OECD, you have to put a 49% capital charge. So look at Latin America. Colombia is in the OECD, 25% capital charge. Uruguay is outside OECD, 49% capital charge. It makes no sense. So what we call here is, can we look very carefully at the unintended side effects of this financial regulation, which is very good, but is having a lot of consequences. And my last point, NK, and I'm finishing here, credit rating agencies. Credit rating agencies have to be brought around the table, not just to look if the reforms we're pushing for MDBs will have an impact on their ratings as MDBs, the famous AAA of the Asian Development Bank, of the World Bank, and so on. But we need to have them in the room because we need them to better consider the rating of the projects for private investors who invest alongside the World Bank and the MDBs. One example. Today, you have MIGA protection or you don't have MIGA protection. The private segment of the investment gets the same rating. And the rating you get is usually the sovereign rating. So whatever we invent, we are putting money, public schemes to protect the investment, to have guarantees, to have first loss, to have guarantees upon default. If you look at what S&P, Moody's, and others are doing, this part gets the same rating, which is a sovereign rating. So we have to work with them so the reforms that you and others want to implement, that we support, to have the full effectiveness. Not only we have to have a fit-for-purpose financial regulation, just to review the very technical points. It's very geeky, it's very technical, it's not very politically appealing, but it's essential if we want to achieve what the Minister was saying, a growth agenda that serves development in a way which is not divisive globally.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily, for those valuable comments. I now turn to you, Veera. Given your vast experience, not only of development process and dynamics in Africa, given your experience in the multilateral institutions, and the fact that you have written iconic pieces along with many others, some of whom are in this room, like Amar and Nick, on the issues of climate financing, do you, with this experience, how do you see the current scenario, and whether the climate goals and the geopolitical goals are at a conflicting point when they would not be able to meet the kind of expectations which are necessary in your study to meet the expectations on climate financing? Veera. And in addition to this, if there's any other point on which you believe, after hearing the Minister, you would like to make any comment or observation, please feel free to do so now.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the Minister started with talking about the world is on fire was our definition. I mean, if you actually think about the fact that the world is on fire and the assumption that we will go into many more polycrises, and so we will start seeing new and different alliances, does that mean that at some point we all become allies? And I think most recently of the United States and Iran in an oil scarcity environment beginning to sort of come closer together. And so your comment from Cordelia in 300 BC on permanent interest becomes an important one. Now, if we agree that growth is a permanent interest for everybody and getting out of poverty is a permanent interest, and we start from that as the place to go, then almost irreconcilably we must agree then that that new growth strategy has to be something that's global and that we will all come behind it. And that's the first point. Thank you very much for bringing Africa into the G20. In Africa now the conversation is, yes, now we're in the G20, what do we do? And how do we go around that? And I think that prior to the Indian G20 presidency, there was always a question about, what does one really get out of the G20? And I must say that the really skillful management of the G20 process by the Indian presidency has actually probably reignited interest in the G20. I think the work that was done on MDB reform, which I was honored to be a part of, that is led by NK and His Excellency NK Singh and Larry Summers, was, I think, a proof that there was a focus on development. There was a focus on how do we finance this development. We have spoken about the need for $2.4 trillion to do the climate financing part. 1 trillion should come from, minus China, 1 trillion should come from external financing, which essentially means donor contributions. But if you look at IDA, donor contributions to IDA have been going down for the last 10 years. And so the question is, can we actually push that conversation? And maybe one of the things that a G20 with an Africa membership will do is to actually bring that conversation to the table every year, because there's no IDA country in the G20 by definition, and so it's never a big issue. And so I think that when one asks the question, what does an African involvement in the G20 bring, it actually brings that. It brings the voices of a whole constellation of people into the conversation. Even in the report on the IEG and MDB's Bigger, Better, and Bolder that we wrote, one of the struggles that we've all been having is, why can't we take things to scale? And India has a very good model today in the digital public infrastructure space. You have demonstrated that it works, you have demonstrated its benefits for poverty, for growth, for job creation. And I wonder now whether there is space somewhere to create partnerships that make the India DPI a global DPI. And if one were able to bring that to scale, there are huge transformations in the world. And of course, India's share of global trade will increase enormously once something like that is happening. I come from a continent where almost 500 million people are not documented. So just imagine, so we don't have those savings. If you don't have those savings, you don't have the investment. If you don't have the investment, then of course, Basel rules say that you cannot invest on my continent because it's too risky, and there's no KYC, and so I think that the DPI from India is quite an important tool that maybe should not remain in India, but we should find a way of globalizing it. I was going to talk a little bit about finance, but since Amini talked about it, I wouldn't talk about it, but it's something that is happening. As we work and we wrote the report on the IEG, we're all now saying guarantees are the best thing, and it's very important to do guarantees. But I think we need to step back a little bit and also ask whether in the guarantee framework, we should guarantee local private sector. Because today, the guarantee framework only guarantees foreign private sector, which means that a Tata industry in India cannot get a guarantee to do an investment in India. And so there is an almost inbuilt bias for almost, I would say, Western investments in emerging markets. And I think we need to begin to change even the institutional architecture around funding and investment for development. Because we don't grow local investment, and as we know, because there's so many crises, every time there's a crisis, foreign investment and capital flight become what we talk about. And so I think that as we do that, we can maybe open and create more room and more space for trade. And finally, on the climate, this is my last point, on climate, as I said this morning, I think India really holds the sort of ground zero of the climate conversation. The world is looking. The world has watched you lead with excellence the G20 presidency, and I think now we will be looking to see how you lead this climate transition, or maybe help the conversation, not just on financing the new, but financing the transition as well. And what is the strategy that goes from one point to the other? I believe it's battery technology. And if it is battery technology, then it is huge industrialization. It is huge skills, and you mentioned education skills as sort of the last point of your speech. I think focusing how we create a new youthful class that is able to take us into this new battery technology space is going to be quite important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Minister has kindly agreed to take a couple of questions, perhaps not more than three.
I'd be happy if the others did as well. It will lighten the burden on me.
Oh, yes, of course. Prachi.
Maybe you have a question. I can ask a question anytime. Nick?
First of all, I would like to begin by congratulating Mr. N.K. Singh for bringing Nari Shakti or women power to the discussion. My question is for Minister. Minister, you referred to a number of terms and it's been buzzing in the conference everywhere: deglobalization, fragmentation, decoupling, and now reglobalization. Despite all this, if you actually look at the data, trade, international trade has been remarkably resilient, globally and including for India. So, if you think about it, have we really overestimated, the risks to trade globalization, or, how do you address this disconnect between the rhetoric and the facts? Thank you very much.
All right.
Take a question by question.
No, we take a couple of questions, and then we will also not all questions are directed at the Minister. So this one, Prachi, you made it very specific that you wanted him to reply. We'll bunch a couple of questions, and then Nick, you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you very much, Minister, for joining us, and congratulations to India on its extraordinarily successful leadership of the G20, and that's where my question is. India defined the overall set of issues around development and sustainable development, and inclusive and resilient development, and it defined them in a very clear, strong way, and it brought the other countries with it. G20 presidencies sometimes have their own particular enthusiasm related to some particular interest or obsession of the president or prime minister of that country. Of course, global development is much more general than that. So the question then becomes how that's taken across into the next G20s and the continuity of this redefinition of the agenda, including, of course, around the financial issues on which Amelie and Vera spoke so well and clearly. Could you say something about how now you see that agenda generally on growth and development being taken forward, and including on the financial side where India led so strongly? Thank you.
Thank you. Ishwar, you wanted to ask a question, please.
Notwithstanding the vast expertise of Dr. Songwe and Minister Monchala, this is a question about India to Minister Jaishankar. Minister, what would you think of as the right path towards the economic and geopolitical de-risking for India? More specifically, as we look around the world right now, we see economic and geopolitical alliances falling in line with each other. Now, the path that India seems to have struck out on is to maintain alliances that seem to be based on specific issues. On economic issues, you have certain alliances. On political issues, you seem to have certain alliances. And even there, it seems to be finely divided by issues. Now, that has the advantage for India of providing a lot more strategic autonomy. But is there a risk to this approach that you develop much less deep, much less reliable alliances, especially when trouble comes?
All right. Was there any? Yes, please. Pradeep?
Thank you, NK. Minister, good afternoon. Two questions. One is the way we approach this whole issue about IFI reforms, MDB reforms. Can we not approach the issue of the Security Council reforms, which has been hanging fire since a long time? Second question is, congratulations to bring AU into the fold. When are we holding the next Indo-African summit? Thank you.
Okay, one last question here.
Yeah, thank you very much. A question would go to the whole panel. How would you see the strategy to address the new collective climate finance goal that is scheduled to be finalized next year? What should be the steps to do in the next 12 months? Which alliances to forge?
Thank you very much. I think that let's begin with the last question, since it was addressed to all members of the panel. And Veera, why don't you take the first shot at this last question?
That was a good question. I think three things. First of all, it's good to have the goal. Secondly, we know that we are right now in a very complex environment where most likely the goal will not be achieved. I think what is more important is that countries all revise their targets to make sure that they can meet it. But it is not enough to meet it, as we have, to revise your targets, as we've been saying, and as Emily, we need the financing. And if we cannot provide for the financing, then the goal becomes, I think, an empty objective. And so the only way that the goal makes sense is that we have the financing to back it. And that's why the IEG report is so important in saying, you know, let's see whether we can pull together all the resources that are needed. I mean, right now we have $130 billion of development finance to finance what is, we say, a climate and a world that is going to be on fire. As an international community and as the G20, don't we really believe that 390 billion will be good enough to do that? Because that's the number we're asking for in the IEG report that you asked for. And it's not that big of a jump, 390 billion to, you know, do the 1 to 5 scale to a trillion. I think until we get that, we can never be able to say that we will meet the targets of that goal. And that's why, one, it has been very important that the Indian presidency asked for the report. Now we have the numbers. The second thing will be we need to find the resources, commit them, disburse them, and then we must get the private sector around the table to get us the...
Okay. Emily, do you want to add anything to what
Yes,
Veera said?
not to contradict any of the words, but I think if we want to set new goals, we have to be extremely lucid on our capacity to meet them and therefore to organize the system so as the goals are out of reach, because if not, if they're out of reach, I think we lose a lot of credibility. So one, we have to see how we make the financial flows going again from the OECD to the non-OECD world. And if we don't manage to do this at scale and with the right speed, most of what we have been discussing here for 4 days will be extremely difficult to achieve. I agree with Vera. We need to look at how we guarantee more risky investment in domestic currency from domestic investors. And the third point, which is a link to the question about Nick, continuity, I think we also have to be very lucid on the diversity of challenges. India has a challenge around coal. Brazil has a challenge with forest. Europe has a challenge with a lot of the way we produce high-intensive production and our lifestyle and our housing and so on. So we need also to be able to differentiate. Because if we sum money with so different objectives to fulfill, at the end we have the impression that we merge things which are totally different in the nature of instruments we need, in the speed we need, in the timing we need. Last point, just want to say that France supports the revision of the UN Security Council for many years, and we are here a supporter of India.
Thank you. I think that logically takes us to the next set of questions. And I think that both you, Veera, and Evelyn, Nick, all three talked about the continuity part of the G20. But the fact remains, Minister, that by its very definition, the leadership of the G20 is an annual process. It's a rolling stone. And in a rolling stone, how does one ensure that with each year some moss is gathered which doesn't roll over and is in some ways nourished? The core question is the continuity aspect of a G20, even though the leadership is annually rolled over. Minister.
Rolling stone is one description. I think a relay race might be a good one as well, which is that the baton is handed from one runner to the other. And relays work when you practice a lot, because mostly you screw up when you hand the baton over. That's where it slips. One of the good things about the G20, and this has been our experience, and I'm sure Amitabh would agree with me, you start working on the G20 a full year before you actually get to be president, and you remain associated with the G20 kind of running for a full year after you've handed over. So this whole Troika concept actually is to my mind very useful in ensuring that that rolling stone or the relay team works smoothly. I would say if one looks at the issues going forward, and that's where I want to add a comment in a way to the question about financing, where are the resources? Because at the end of the day, that's the crucial question, that's the issue that we were grappling with, that's really what your report is focused on. And look at the irony of it. At one level, we all say with utmost sincerity that, the planet is facing a crisis. It's actually facing an existential crisis. Now, imagine you don't have the money to come up for an existential crisis. So either it's not existential, or you don't have money, or you don't know how to make the two meet. Now, we have seen, and I mean no disrespect here, we have seen that there have been occasions where actually resources have come on the table. They can come on the table for a conflict, or mitigating a conflict, or responding to a conflict. I do feel that it's crucial for the G20 leadership, perhaps more than the G20 leadership, to actually keep, I think the rhetoric, the messaging, the sense of the strength of purpose is very important to reiterate if we actually need to get the resources. And to my mind, some of what I heard from my fellow panelists actually have the answers. If the financial flows, the private sector financial flows are going to be restricted to your own catchment area or your own comfort zone, you got a problem. If you are too risk averse, or your practices are too antiquated to leverage or to multiply, I think you got a problem. So how do we change our way of working? How do we deploy resources more innovatively? Because if one looks at it, let us say every decade or even half a decade, there's no question we are all taking climate change much more seriously than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So how do we translate that public concern? There are a whole set of countries today where actually climate is almost the determining political issue. Governments, political parties are elected or not, sometimes depending on what their stance is on climate. So given the intensity of the issue, given the global awareness, given the fact that we all recognize today the resources is the crunch issue. I think what we have started off in Delhi, I mean, it would be very much our hope that this continues through Brazil, carries on to South Africa, that we don't really take our foot off the gas pedal. And gas pedal is not the right word for climate change, but whatever. How do we keep that going? I'm kind of.
Thank you. I think that there were some other questions. Prachi, what was the specific question of yours?
No, I remember her question.
Please.
Okay. Now, her question essentially was, given the stability in global trade, international trade, when people speak about decoupling and de-risking, etc., it's not happening in reality. I mean, if you look at the reality is extraordinarily stable, and the rhetoric is very, very, shall I say, different. There is some truth in what you're saying, because at the end of the day, I mean, a point which I myself made, which is, I do think that global, especially global manufacturing today is so deep, it has such a strong, it's hardwired so strongly. There are certain geographies which have made it such a speciality that it will be very difficult to change it. I don't think you should look for a quantitative answer. I think you should look for specific domains. That is why, I mean, to my mind, decoupling was never serious. Decoupling is a great political phrase. I just don't think it's practical. And to me, even de-risking is let us say, not a easily realizable goal. But if you look at certain specific domains, if you look, say, for example, at telecom, I think the last 5 years has seen a huge change where the global, where market shares of companies are concerned, where, who is comfortable with whom. I think we are going to see this to some degree as the EV industry unfolds. I think you will see it in critical emerging technology. So you're still going to have very much a continuity in terms of basic manufacturing and basic trade. But I do think critical areas of it are going to get distanced, and especially, as artificial intelligence becomes much more central to our existence, and therefore it's all about data. And it's all about where data is generated and who processes it and who deploys it. My sense is you're going to see a distancing that is coming. So I do predict that it will not be what it is today.
Well, thank you very much. I think that you have answered all the questions, but Minister, I cannot let you go without asking.
I have Ishwar's question.
Ishwar, but you have de-risking, you have dealt.
No, he had a very interesting question.
Okay.
His question was, if you do these hedges, and he recognized we do some economic hedge and a lot of political hedge, one of the risks of hedging is you're really caught between two stools. That, as he said, in difficult times, what happens? I think it's a very serious question, and there's historical data, even in our own experience, to show the risks of hedging or ambivalence or, shall I say, not aligning at times in difficult situations. So it is not a mechanical exercise, it is not a literal exercise. I would say being in the middle is not the answer. But being on the extremes is not the answer either. So it's a bit of a science, but believe me, it's a great art. How do you actually get your combinations right, the issues right? and in certain areas, how do we actually make sure that the understandings are really very, very strong. And if I were to give you a practical example today, I would point, say, to something like Quad as an example, where if I look pre-Quad and post-Quad, I think it's made an enormous difference to the degree of trust and comfort and chemistry that the 4 Quad partners have developed with each other. Without, by the way, India becoming a treaty ally, which the other 3 Quad partners are to each other. So it's not an insuperable obstacle, but it's a challenge. And on the UNSC, you know, why can't it be like the IFI? I mean, first of all, the IFI is not a done deal yet. So I think they've got a lot of work to do. But UNSC, because you know, UN Security Council is so fundamental to the global architecture. In a sense, it's the last bastion when it comes to resistance to change. You know, though it will really be the toughest. So many other regimes flow from it. You know, the P5 also, remember, happened to be the N5 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there'll be other, you know, knock-on effects, and the resistance is proportional to the significance of the change. On the Africa Summit, we hope, you know, it's got delayed. We are sorry about it, but it's not, honestly, there's a lot of interest in India to do it. So I hope we'll be able to do it fairly soon.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, I cannot let you go, Minister. And I'm not in any way suggesting that you are hedging that question. But neither in the question nor in your thing, there was any word or suggestion on how do you see the Indo-Canadian situation play itself out. And that's a question which, on which I think that we would be very happy to have your response.
Let me make 3 comments there. The relationship right now is going through a difficult phase, but I do want to say it's you know, the problems we have are with a certain segment of Canadian politics and the policies which flow from that. So I want people to understand, in a sense, the extent of the issue. Number 2, right now, the big concern which people have is on visas. You know, some weeks ago, we stopped issuing visas in Canada because it was no longer safe for our diplomats to go to work to issue visas. So their safety and security was the primary reason we had to temporarily stop the issue of visas. We're tracking it very closely. My hope, my expectation is that situation would improve in the sense that our people would have greater confidence in being able to do their basic duty as diplomats, because, as you know, ensuring safety and security of diplomats is the most fundamental aspect of the Vienna Convention. And right now, that is what has in many ways been challenged in Canada, that our people are not safe, our diplomats are not safe. So if we see progress there, I would like very much to resume the issue of visas. My hope would be that it's something which would happen very, very soon. Finally, you know, there's this whole issue of parity, that the size of you know, how many diplomats there are of one country versus how many diplomats there are of the other country. Parity is very much provided for by the Vienna Convention, which is the relevant international rule on this. But in our case, we invoked parity because we had concerns about continuous interference in our affairs by Canadian personnel. We haven't made much of that public. My sense is over a period of time, more stuff will come out, and people will understand why we had the kind of discomfort with many of them which we did.
Well, thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of this closing plenary. But let me say that this closing session has been a very illuminating one. Your initial statements, Minister, covered a wide range of issues which covered on all the three aspects, which is the basic framework of today's closing session, on aspects of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and navigating the Poli crisis. I think that we covered many aspects of this. And I thought that in the question-answer sessions, the issues on the challenges of an orderly transition to an era of renewable energy, to the issues of how to make the initiatives of the G20 a more abiding one, even as you go forward on an annual thing, and the idea of the Troika being given more operational content was an important aspect which you did, and I think that this is embedded in the documents, but I think we need to take this forward as we go along. Also, I think that on the issues of the reform of the international financial architecture, in a complex situation of that kind, we have covered a lot of area. I think that we have ended this today's concluding session, Minister, on a somewhat optimistic note, because you did say that you hope that in the light of some of the things which you may or may not have wished to share, the resumption of the visa with Canada will also see perhaps a happier end than may be evident now. So I think that with that optimistic note, let me on my behalf thank the panelists for all their comments which they have made and the interventions which they have made, both to you, Emily, and to Veera. And of course, our great gratitude to you, Minister, for having spared your time and to have interrupted your travel schedule in being able to accommodate this request of ours, that we had the pleasure, if you recall, of having you as the concluding speaker at our first Kautilya Economic Conclave, when I had the privilege of moderating an interaction between you and at that time Senior Minister Thurman, now President Thurman, whom you must have met during your day before yesterday. So we again conclude with this fact that we look forward to our continued engagement as we go forward in having further areas of the Kautilya Economic Conclave. Thank you very much. With those remarks, I bring to an end this closing session.